Chapter 11 of the Elusive Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. Read for LibriVox.org by Karen Savage in January 2008. Chapter 11. The Challenge. It all occurred just before midnight, in one of the smaller rooms which lead an enfilade from the principal ballroom. Dancing had been going on for some time, but the evening was close, and there seemed to be a growing desire on the part of Lady Blakeney's guests to wander desultorily through the gardens and glass-houses, or sit about where some measure of coolness could be obtained. There was a rumour that a new and charming French artiste was to sing a few peculiarly ravishing songs unheard in England before. Close to the main ballroom was the octagon music-room, which was brilliantly illuminated, and in which a large number of chairs had been obviously disposed for the comfort of an audience. Into this room many of the guests had already assembled. It was quite clear that a chamber concert, select and attractive as were all Lady Blakeney's entertainments, was in contemplation. Marguerite herself, released for a moment from her constant duties near her royal guests, had strolled through the smaller rooms, accompanied by Juliette, in order to search for Mademoiselle Candeille, and to suggest the commencement of the improvised concert. Desiree Candeille had kept herself very much aloof throughout the evening, only talking to the one or two gentlemen whom her hostess had presented to her on her arrival, and with Monsieur Chauvelin always in close attendance upon her every movement. Presently, when dancing began, she retired to a small boudoir, and there sat down, demurely waiting, until Lady Blakeney should require her services. When Marguerite and Juliette Marny entered the little room, she rose and came forward a few steps. "I am ready, madame," she said pleasantly, "whenever you wish me to begin. I have thought out a short programme. Shall I start with the gay or the sentimental songs?" But before Marguerite had time to utter a reply, she felt her arm nervously clutched by a hot and trembling hand. Who is this woman?" murmured Juliette Marny close to her ear. The young girl looked pale and very agitated, and her large eyes were fixed in unmistakable wrath upon the French actress before her. A little startled, not understanding Juliette's attitude, Marguerite tried to reply lightly. "This is Mademoiselle Candeille, Juliette dear," she said, affecting the usual formal introduction, "of the Varieté Theatre of Paris. Mademoiselle Desiree Candeille, who will sing some charming French ditties for us tonight." While she spoke, she kept a restraining hand on Juliette's quivering arm. Already, with the keen intuition which had been on the qui vive the whole evening, she scented some mystery in this sudden outburst on the part of her young protégée. But Juliette did not heed her. She felt surging up in her young, overburdened heart all the wrath and the contempt of the persecuted fugitive aristocrat against the triumphant usurper. She had suffered so much from that particular class of the risen kitchen wench of which the woman before her was so typical an example. Years of sorrow, of poverty were behind her, loss of fortune, of kindred, of friends, she, even now a pauper, living on the bounty of strangers. And all this through no fault of her own, the fault of her class mayhap, but not hers. She had suffered much, and was still overwrought and nerve-strung. For some reason she could not afterwards have explained, she felt spiteful and uncontrolled, goaded into stupid fury by the look of insolence and of triumph with which Candeille calmly regarded her. Afterwards she would willingly have bitten out her tongue for her vehemence, but for the moment she was absolutely incapable of checking the torrent of her own emotions. "Mademoiselle Candeille, indeed!" she said in wrathful scorn. "Desiree Candeille, you mean, Lady Blakeney. My mother's kitchen maid, flaunting shamelessly my dear mother's jewels, which she has stolen, mayhap." The young girl was trembling from head to foot, tears of anger obscured her eyes, her voice, which fortunately remained low, not much above a whisper, was thick and husky. "Juliette, Juliette, I entreat you," admonished Marguerite, "you must control yourself, you must, indeed you must. Mademoiselle Candeille, I beg of you to retire." But Candeille, well schooled in the part she had to play, had no intention of quitting the field of battle. The more wrathful and excited Mademoiselle de Marny became, the more insolent and triumphant waxed the young actress's whole attitude. An ironical smile played around the corners of her mouth, her almond-shaped eyes were half closed, regarding through drooping lashes the trembling figure of the young impoverished aristocrat. Her head was thrown well back, in obvious defiance of the social conventions which should have forbidden a fracas in Lady Blakeney's hospitable house, and her fingers provocatively toyed with the diamond necklace which glittered and sparkled round her throat. She had no need to repeat the words of a well-learnt part. Her own wit, her own emotions and feelings helped her to act just as her employer would have wished her to do. Her native vulgarity helped her to assume the very bearing which he would have desired. In fact, at this moment, Desiree Candeille had forgotten everything save the immediate present. a more than contemptuous snub from one of those penniless aristocrats who had rendered her own sojourn in London so unpleasant and unsuccessful. She had suffered from these snubs before, but had never had the chance of forcing an esclandre as a result of her own humiliation. That spirit of hatred for the rich and idle classes, which was so characteristic of revolutionary France, was alive and hot within her. She had never had an opportunity, she, the humble fugitive actress from a minor Paris theatre, to retort with forcible taunts to the ironical remarks made at and before her by the various poverty-stricken but haughty emigres who swarmed in those very same circles of London society into which she herself had vainly striven to penetrate. Now at last, one of this same hated class, provoked beyond self-control, was allowing childish and unreasoning fury to outstrip the usual calm irony of aristocratic rebuffs. Juliette had paused a while, in order to check the wrathful tears which, much against her will, were choking the words in her throat and blinding her eyes. "Hoity-toity!" laughed Candeille, "hark at the young baggage!" But Juliette had turned to Marguerite and began explaining volubly. "My mother's jewels," she said in the midst of her tears. "Ask her how she came by them. When I was obliged to leave the home of my fathers, stolen from me by the revolutionary government, I contrived to retain my mother's jewels. You remember, I told you just now, the Abbe Foucquet, dear old man, saved them for me, that and a little money which I had. He took charge of them, he said he would place them in safety with the ornaments of his church, and now I see them round that woman's neck. I know that he would not have parted with them save with his life." All the while that the young girl spoke in a voice half choked with sobs, Marguerite tried with all the physical and mental will at her command to drag her out of the room, and thus to put a summary ending to this unpleasant scene. She ought to have felt angry with Juliette for this childish and senseless outburst, were it not for the fact that somehow she knew within her innermost heart that all this had been arranged and preordained, not by fate, not by a higher hand, but by the most skilful intriguer present-day France had ever known. And even now, as she was half succeeding in turning Juliette away from the sight of Candeille, she was not the least surprised or startled at seeing Chauvelin standing in the very doorway through which she had hoped to pass. One glance at his face had made her fears tangible and real. There was a look of satisfaction and triumph in his pale, narrow eyes, a flash in them of approbation directed at the insolent attitude of the French actress. He looked like the stage manager of a play, content with the effect his own well-arranged scenes were producing. What he hoped to gain by this somewhat vulgar quarrel between the two women, Marguerite of course could not guess. That something was lurking in his mind, inimical to herself and to her husband, she did not for a moment doubt, and at this moment she felt that she would have given her very life to induce Candeille and Juliette to cease this passage of arms without further provocation on either side. But though Juliette might have been ready to yield to Lady Blakeney's persuasion, Desiree Candeille, under Chauvelin's eye, and fired by her own desire to further humiliate this overbearing aristocrat, did not wish the little scene to end so tamely just yet. "Your old calotin has made to part with his booty, my dear," she said, with a contemptuous shrug of her bare shoulders. "Paris and France have been starving these many years past. A paternal government seized all it could, with which to reward those that served it well, whilst all that would have been brought bread and meat for the poor was being greedily stowed away by shameless traitors." Juliette winced at the insult. "Oh!" she moaned, as she buried her flaming face in her hands. Too late now did she realise that she had deliberately stirred up a mud heap and sent noisome insects buzzing about her ears. "Mademoiselle," said Marguerite authoritatively, "I must ask you to remember that Mademoiselle de Marny is my friend, and that you are a guest in my house." "I try not to forget it," rejoined Candeille lightly, "but of a truth you must admit, citizeness, that it would require the patience of a saint to put up with the insolence of a penniless baggage, who but lately has had to stand her trial in her own country for impurity of conduct." There was a moment's silence, whilst Marguerite distinctly heard a short sigh of satisfaction escaping from the lips of Chauvelin. Then a pleasant laugh broke upon the ears of the four actors who were enacting the dramatic little scene, and Sir Percy Blakeney, immaculate in his rich white satin coat and filmy lace ruffles, exquisite in manners and courtesy, entered the little boudoir, and with his long back slightly bent, his arm outstretched in a graceful and well-studied curve, he approached Mademoiselle Desiree Candeille. "May I have the honour," he said with his most elaborate air of courtly deference, "of conducting Mademoiselle to her chaise?" In the doorway just behind him stood His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, chatting with apparent carelessness to Sir Andrew Ffoulkes and Lord Anthony Dewhurst. A curtain beyond the